Guy Penrod has performed gospel music for millions of people across more than 3 decades, in arenas and auditoriums, and through television screens in living rooms all over this country. And almost nobody watching him stand on that homecoming stage ever suspected he was carrying a private refusal about one specific song. A Bill Gaither song, one of the most recognized in the entire gospel catalog. Not a refusal born of artistic disagreement, and not a contract dispute or a scheduling conflict, but something far more personal than any of that, and far more painful. Stay with us, because what Guy eventually revealed about that silence, and why he kept it as long as he did, is the kind of story the gospel community rarely gets to hear told with the honesty it deserves. By the 10-minute mark, you'll understand why this refusal had nothing to do with the music at all. To understand why this matters, you have to understand who Guy Penrod is to the people who have followed Southern gospel music across the last 3 decades. His full name is Guy Wayne Penrod, and on March 2, 1963, he was born in Texas into a family where faith and music were never treated as separate things. His father served as a minister, which meant that church wasn't a destination the Penrod family drove to on Sunday mornings. It was the center around which everything else organized itself, the place where life got interpreted and meaning got made. Guy grew up hearing the old hymns the way other children hear lullabies, absorbing them before he had the words to describe what they were doing to him. And by the time his voice had fully developed, it had become something that would eventually stop audiences cold. He joined the Gaither vocal band in 1994, and for fans who first encountered the homecoming recordings during those years, his arrival felt like something that had been arranged long before he ever walked through the door. That voice, deep and rich, with a range that could settle into the low registers and then reach somewhere genuinely unexpected, became one of the defining sounds of what the Homecoming series produced during its most celebrated era. Songs like Redeemed and Goin' in Style and I'm Not Giving Up gave audiences something to hold on to during hard seasons, and his delivery carried a conviction that went well beyond what a trained performer produces. Fans didn't simply enjoy his singing, they believed him. And that distinction in gospel music is the only one that ultimately matters. For 14 years, from 1994 through 2008, Guy stood alongside Bill Gaither, David Phelps, Wes Hampton, Mark Lowry, and the rotating cast of voices that made the Gaither vocal band one of the most recognized groups in Christian music history. Through hundreds of recordings and homecoming events and television specials watched by generations of believers, he gave audiences everything he had, night after night. And through all of it, there was one song he would not sing. One Bill Gaither composition that, when it surfaced in rehearsal or in setlist conversations, Guy quietly and consistently stepped away from. For millions of fans who grew up with those homecoming videos playing on a Saturday evening, Guy Penrod wasn't simply a singer. He was part of the soundtrack of their faith. Which is exactly why what he was carrying in private for all those years deserves to be understood on its own terms. Here is where the story requires some patience, because the reason behind that refusal doesn't make full sense without understanding what the song "He Touched Me" meant long before it became a recording. Bill Gaither wrote "He Touched Me" in 1963. When he was a young schoolteacher trying to put into words an experience of grace he'd spent his whole life hearing described, but had struggled to articulate himself. What came out was something unusually direct, not a theological argument, but a testimony, a first-person account of a God who reaches into human suffering and makes contact. The song spread through Christian music circles, reached churches and choirs across the country, and then, in 1972, entered an entirely different level of American consciousness when Elvis Presley recorded it for a gospel album that earned a Grammy Award. By the time Guy Penrod was growing up in Texas, He Touched Me had already traveled through the culture in ways that Bill Gaither, writing it quietly in the early 1960s, could not have anticipated. And in a small church in Texas, a minister named Penrod was singing it too. Guy's father didn't simply perform "He Touched Me." He preached the idea behind it, the theological weight of a God who doesn't observe human pain from a distance, but moves toward it. For the Penrod family, that song carried the particular authority that only comes when a piece of music has been lived inside, rather than performed at. Guy grew up watching his father deliver those words with the kind of conviction that belongs only to someone who believes every syllable from personal experience, not from professional obligation. Which is why the first time Bill Gaither brought "He Touched Me" into a Gaither vocal band rehearsal and turned toward Guy expecting him to take the lead, what happened next caught everyone in the room off guard. Guy stepped back. No argument, no scene, no lengthy explanation. He told Bill, quietly and without much elaboration at first, that he wasn't able to sing that song. Not yet. Bill Gaither has said in interviews across the years that he has worked with artists who carry things into their music that audiences never see, and that the strongest performances almost always come from exactly that kind of weight. But what Guy was doing wasn't about managing weight for a better performance. He was protecting something that hadn't fully healed, and he understood, from everything his father had taught him about ministry, that some things shouldn't be presented before they've been genuinely processed. Performance and testimony are not the same thing, and in gospel music, only one of them holds up over time. Stay with us, because what Guy later explained about that season and what it reveals about the relationship between grief and Christian ministry is the part of this story that most coverage has moved past far too quickly. The full picture comes into focus when you understand what was unfolding in Guy Penrod's personal life during the same years he was building his reputation inside the Gaither organization. His father's health had begun to decline while Guy was on the road, traveling the circuit that Gaither homecoming events demanded. Distance from family is one of the costs a touring musician accepts, but when the family member in question is the pastor who shaped everything you understand about faith, music, and what ministry actually means, that distance carries a weight that touring schedules don't account for. Guy has spoken in various public conversations across the years about his father's faith being the foundation underneath everything he eventually became as a singer and as a believer. The elder Penrod's ministry never reached a national platform. No recordings, no television appearances, no marquee name in Christian music circles. What it had instead was integrity, the kind built through decades of consistent presence in a community, through a life that held up under close examination, and through a theology expressed not just from a pulpit, but in daily life where his family could see it. When his father's health deteriorated, and the losses that follow that kind of decline began to accumulate, "He Touched Me" became something Guy couldn't separate from grief. Not because the song is sorrowful, it isn't, not even slightly, but because it belonged so completely to his father, to the way his father had sung it and meant it and built his ministry around it, that standing up and singing it himself felt like wearing something that hadn't been fully handed down to him yet. The song wasn't available, not because it was off limits, but because it was still in the process of becoming his. Bill Gaither, to his credit, never pressed. And this is where the relationship between these two men reveals itself as something more than professional. Gaither has spent the entirety of his ministry working from the understanding that gospel music operates differently from other music, that it carries the weight of real lives and real encounters with Christian faith, and that the artists who perform it bring that weight with them whether the audience knows it or not. He had watched enough singers across enough decades to recognize when someone needed time rather than a conversation, and he gave Guy exactly that. What nobody in the Gaither organization fully anticipated was how long that time would need to be, and what it would ultimately take to end it. And this is where the story takes the turn that most accounts of it have missed entirely. Guy Penrod eventually sang "He Touched Me," not because enough time had passed and he'd decided to move on, and not because the grief had faded to a manageable level. The change came from something his wife Angie said to him one evening in a private conversation that Guy has described as one of the turning points of his adult life. Angie Penrod has been his partner through every season of his ministry, raising 8 children while he traveled and recorded, and eventually built a solo career after leaving the Gaither vocal band in 2008. She has been present for the whole arc of what Guy has become, which means she has also been present for the places where that arc stalled or struggled. And on the evening when this particular conversation happened, she told her husband something simple. She told him that his father's relationship with that song didn't end with his father's life. It lived in Guy now, carried forward in the voice and the conviction and the understanding of ministry that his father had spent decades building into him. Every time Guy stood up and sang those words with genuine belief, his father's ministry continued. Not as a tribute, not as a performance of grief, as a genuine extension of what the elder Penrod had started in that Texas church. Guy has recalled that conversation as the moment the refusal ended. Not because grief was finished. Grief doesn't resolve on a schedule, and nobody who has lost a parent believes otherwise. But because the grief had been repositioned. It was no longer standing between him and the song. It had become the reason the song mattered. The first time he sang "He Touched Me" with the Gaither vocal band after that conversation, Bill Gaither was watching from across the stage, and by multiple accounts from people who were present that evening, something about the performance felt different from the first note. Not louder, and not more technically accomplished. Just more real. The particular kind of real that arrives when someone has paid personally for every word they're delivering. Fans in the audience that night felt it, and many of them couldn't have explained exactly what they were responding to. That's how genuine ministry functions. It doesn't announce its credentials. It simply lands. For those of us who have followed Guy Penrod's journey from the early homecoming recordings through his solo years and beyond, this story carries a meaning that goes past biography. Christian music in the current era often gets evaluated on measurements that have nothing to do with what makes it Christian. Streaming numbers, production quality, social media reach, chart performance. Against that backdrop, a man who refused to perform a beloved song because he hadn't finished grieving his father represents something worth slowing down to consider. Gospel music, at its best, has always operated as testimony. Not performance in the entertainment industry sense, but testimony in the theological sense, bearing witness to something true about your own life and your own encounter with faith. What Guy's refusal tells us is that he understood the difference between those two things, and that he chose testimony over performance, even when choosing otherwise would have been easier and more comfortable for everyone involved. If you've been a fan of Guy's ministry since those early homecoming days, you know exactly what it felt like to watch him stand on that stage and sing with everything he had. And you've probably sensed, even without knowing this story, that something was always operating beneath the surface that the camera couldn't fully capture. This is the part of the story that explains that feeling. His father didn't witness every chapter of what Guy became. That's one of the hard truths grief forces on everyone who lives long enough to face it, and no amount of faith removes that particular ache entirely. But the ministry built in a Texas church by a pastor who never sought a platform shaped a voice that reached millions of people across multiple decades. Legacy doing exactly what legacy is supposed to do, traveling forward through people, not publications. There's one more part of this story that most people haven't connected yet, and it involves Bill Gaither's own relationship with the song at the center of all of this. "He Touched Me" isn't simply one of Gaither's compositions among many. It's the song that, by most accounts, established him as a serious writer within Southern gospel and broader Christian music circles. He's talked in interviews about writing it quickly, with the feeling that it arrived more than it was constructed, and about the years afterward when he watched it move through American religious culture in ways he hadn't anticipated. Elvis Presley's 1972 recording reached an audience that traditional gospel channels never would have touched. And Gaither has been candid about the strangeness of hearing his words return to him through a voice that large and that famous. But what has meant the most to Gaither across the decades, by his own account, isn't the famous version. It's the versions sung by people for whom the words are genuinely autobiographical. People who can identify a specific moment, a specific loss or renewal, and say with honesty, "This song is about exactly what happened to me." When Guy Penrod finally sang it, he joined that group, not as an interpreter working to honor a composition, as a witness reporting from somewhere real. The Gaither Homecoming series has understood that distinction better than almost anyone else working in Christian music across the last 40 years, which is a significant part of why it has lasted, while other formats came and went. Trends have repeatedly reshaped what contemporary Christian music sounds like. Production styles have changed several times over, but what keeps people returning to those homecoming recordings, decade after decade, is the persistent sense that the artists on stage are singing from somewhere that actually exists inside them. Guy Penrod's Refusal, and the eventual ending of that refusal, stands as one of the clearest illustrations of that principle in the entire homecoming catalog. What Bill Gaither built wasn't just a recording ministry. He built a space where artists could bring the weight of their real lives and have that weight recognized as the point, not as a complication to be managed. Guy Penrod walked into that space carrying something he couldn't yet share, and Gaither gave him room to wait until he could. That is not a small thing. In an industry built on scheduling and product cycles and quarterly releases, giving an artist the room to wait for something to heal is an act of genuine pastoral care. What happens next for Guy Penrod and his family is something the gospel community will continue to watch with the affection that only accumulates over decades of shared history. His solo career has taken him into chapters the Gaither vocal band years didn't fully predict, and at 61, he carries both the voice and the weight of everything that voice has been through. The two are not separable at this point. The weight is the voice, in the way that matters most. The song he once refused to sing is now, by all accounts, one he returns to without hesitation. And that movement, from refusal to testimony, from private grief to public ministry, is the kind of arc that gospel music has always been built to hold. One question this story doesn't fully answer is whether Guy Penrod has spoken with his own children about the history of that song and what it cost him personally before he could sing it. 8 children carry a great deal of the future, and somewhere in that family there are ears that will eventually carry this forward in directions none of us can predict. Whether "He Touched Me" becomes for one of them what it became for Guy, a song that has to be earned before it can be sung, is something only time will show. Whatever comes next, fans who have followed this ministry across 3 decades know one thing: Guy Penrod's story isn't finished. If this story reached something in you, the next video will as well. We've been following a situation involving another member of the Gaither family, and what came out of that story is every bit as unexpected as what you heard today.